How can BS be bad? For one thing, it restricts female sexuality. If you are a sexually modest woman, BS is bestowed upon you, but if not, look out. Disturbingly, BS predicts negative attitudes towards female rape victims. Here's an example of the type of research showing this effect. Participants read a scenario describing a date rape. After driving her home, the man raped the woman, but either in the car when she tried to get out, or after she had invited the man up to her apartment for a cup of coffee. People who scored high on BS blamed the woman for getting raped, but only when she invited him upstairs. Apparently, just letting a man into your home violates the high standards of sexual purity demanded by benevolent sexists. She was not wearing provocative clothing, no drinking was involved, so it was just the invitation to come upstairs for coffee that led to victim blaming for benevolent sexists. In the Bible, Mary is cast as a virgin, whereas Eve is cast as a sexual villain who tempted Adam into sin. And as a result, they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. These religious stories echo today as the Madonna whore complex, whereby women are viewed as either pure or evil. Peter Glick found that married men who score high on BS also subscribe to Madonna whore beliefs about women, which has dire implications for their sex lives. Specifically, they are unhappy in their marriages, likely because they shy away from marrying women with whom they have sexual chemistry. These men believe that women either make good mothers, like Mary, or eager sexual partners, like Eve, and never the twain shall meet. Therefore, BS restricts male sexuality by promoting the myth that women are either pure or evil. So it's obvious how that restricts female sexuality. But what Peter wanted to see is whether it also harms men, and it does. How else is BS bad? Well, because it promotes viewing women as wonderful but weak, it has multiple negative effects on women. The pedestal that men put women on is high and small, so you can easily fall off. Plus, with no room to move, women are kind of frozen in place, which can affect their ability to think. So in a study conducted in Belgium, female participants imagined applying for a job in a chemical factory described as requiring good social abilities and attentiveness to clients. Then a man recruiting them for the job gave them more details. Finally, they took a job aptitude test, in fact, a test of basic cognitive skills. There were 3 groups of women randomly assigned to different male recruiters. There was a control condition, a hostile sexist recruiter, and a benevolent sexist recruiter. All the control recruiter said was that they would be working only with men. In both the HS and BS conditions, the recruiter explained that a new law on quotas obliged the industry to follow certain employment rules. The HS recruiter said, industry is now restricted to employ a given % of people of the weaker sex. I hope women here won't be offended. They sometimes get so easily upset. You'll work with men only, but don't believe what those feminists are saying on TV. They probably exaggerate women's situation in industry simply to get more favors. BS recorder said industry is now restricted to choose women instead of men in case of equal performance. You'll work with men only, but don't worry, they will cooperate and help you get used to the job. They know that the new employee could be a woman, and they agreed to give you time and help. The test consisted of 9 problems modeled on logic problems in the GRE. That was the primary dependent variable. The researchers also measured the number of items that women attempted, their motivation to score well on the test, and also how sexist they thought the recruiter was. The researchers hypothesized that women in the HS condition would be able to tell the recruiter was sexist. It's pretty obvious, right? And they would therefore be motivated to perform well, basically to show the guy that what he was saying was nonsense and they were just as good as men. And therefore, they should score highest on the test. But women in the BS condition should perform the worst because BS merely implies they are incompetent. Men are going to give them time and help, but it's too subtle to be identified as actually sexist. So the results showed that, sure enough, women were able to identify the hostile sexist recruiter as sexist, and they performed the best. But women did not identify the BS recruiter as sexist, and they performed the worst. No differences in the number of items attempted, but HS women were more motivated than BS women. So here's the means of all of these measures. And the thing I'm pointing out here is that the HS recruiter has a high score on sexism, but the BS recruiter has an even lower score than the control recruiter, right? So somehow all this nice talk actually lures women into thinking, well, he can't possibly be sexist. Look at how nice he is. The test scores, sure enough, women in the HS recruiter condition scored a lot better than women in the BS condition, who scored even worse than controls. Motivation, same thing. BS women have the lowest motivation to do well on the test compared to women in the HS condition, who had the most motivation, and the number of items did not significantly differ across the conditions. So it's not like women in the BS condition performed worse because they kind of gave up and didn't even try. It was more that they weren't motivated to do their very best. BS is sneaky. Although women didn't recognize the sexism in the BS recruiter, his comments led them to doubt their own ability, and as a result, their performance suffered. Can women be taught to recognize BS? Janet Swim had women keep a daily diary of their experiences with sexism throughout a semester. This study was done at Penn State. The results showed that the women recognized hostile sexism easily, but there were no incidents of BS in their daily diaries at all. So then the next semester, Janet Swim trained women to recognize BS the way I'm training my class to recognize BS, and sure enough, that group reported more BS than HS during their daily lives. So the answer to the question, can women be taught to recognize BS, is yes. But without that training, they don't see it as sexist. What about you? Have any of the women in this class ever experienced being patronized by a boss or a teacher? And if so, did you recognize it as sexism at the time? This is a true story that happened to me as an undergrad. I had a stats teacher who only bothered to learn the names of male students. He only called on men in the class. But he also gave the women extra bonus points on his test because he said he liked women and wanted to help them. The message: you're too stupid to do it on your own. I hated the guy, but for years I wondered, how did he make the men in the class feel about women? To find out, Jessica Good and I looked at audience reactions to a female job applicant who was the target of either BS or HS from a male interviewer. So Rutgers undergrads read a job interview in which a female managerial applicant for Costco was interviewed by either a BS man. For example, he called her sweetie and said, "The men here are eager to help you, and I won't have you do anything dangerous." Or she was interviewed by a HS man. For example, "You should know you'll have to close up at night, which can be dangerous, and the men aren't too happy about being led by a woman, so I doubt if you qualify for the job." The results showed that even though the BS recruiter implied she couldn't do the job, he was judged to be less sexist and more likable than the HS recruiter, who outright said, you're not qualified for this job. And to the extent that participants viewed the BS recruiter favorably, they rated the woman as he did. They saw him through his eye. They saw her as less competent and less hireable, and they also saw her as less likable. So participants agreed with his patronizing assessment of her because they didn't view him as sexist. Therefore, the guys in my stats class likely felt superior to women, provided they viewed the teacher as helping women by giving out extra points rather than being a benevolent sexist. In this way, BS undermines women by making them feel inferior, while boosting men by making them feel superior. So John Jost and Aaron Kay reasoned that BS is bad because it co-opts women into accepting their lower place in society as just and fair. Their research was the first to show that because BS is disguised as chivalry, it's disguised so well that women can't see through it, it plays a crucial role in reinforcing sexism. To do this research, they first needed to take a step back and come up with a measure of defending patriarchy, and they called it the Gender System Justification Scale. The gender system is patriarchy, and justifying it would mean that you defend it as just and fair. So I'm going to show you sample items, and I want you to keep in mind that the United States barely makes it into the top 20 for nations high on gender equality. So you'd expect at least women to not see the gender system as just and fair, in which case they should score lower than men. And they typically do. This research was done in 2005. It's 2020. There's been many, many, many studies using the gender system justification scale, and women routinely score lower than men. So here are the items, sample items. For women, the U.S. is the best country in the world to live in. We know that's not true. Everyone, male or female, has a fair shot at wealth and happiness. Society is set up so that men and women usually get what they deserve. The division of labor and families generally operates as it should, and gender roles do not need to be radically restructured. So they had NYU undergrads randomly assigned to one of three groups. Two groups merely read either the BS items or the HS items, rating them for clarity, whereas controls didn't read anything. Then everyone filled out the gender system justification scale. What they found is that in the HS and control groups, men scored higher than women, as is typically found. Men thought the gender system was more just and fair than women did. But women scored the same as men did, just as high, when they read BS statements for clarity. They weren't asked whether they agreed with the statements or not. They just read them for clarity. So mere exposure to benevolent sexism caused women to score the same as men, just as high, on defending patriarchy as just and fair. So this supports the idea that BS effectively co-opts women into accepting unfair power arrangements. By contrast, women who read HS statements scored the lowest of all. The implications are that HS sort of wakes women up. Oh my gosh, this is not a fair system. While BS lulls women to sleep, causing complacency. And if that's true, then exposure to BS should have another outcome, which is to decrease women's interest in activism. So Julia Becker and Stephen Wright randomly assigned German women to read either BS or HS items, ostensibly to check their spelling. And once again, the controls did not read either HS or BS items. And then after that, all the women rated their support for activism, for example, willingness to work towards equal pay and reproductive rights. So what you find is, once again, HS kind of waking women up. They're showing the most support for activism, more so than controls. And then BS women who just read BS items showed the least support for activism, showing that BS causes complacency. BS is bad for women, even though it seemingly assigns women positive qualities and is, therefore, clearly preferable to hostile sexism. But BS seduces women into accepting their lower status, thus preventing them from working for social changes or realizing personal ambitions that would afford them equal respect. BS is bad because it both reflects and reinforces patriarchy, which is why receiving BS from men in power makes women look, feel, and act incompetent. The Dardenne et al. Study was the Belgium study, and then I talked about the Gooden-Rudman Costco interview study. Merely exposing women to BS by having them proofread BS items resulted in more support for the gender hierarchy. That's Jost and Kay's research, and less interest in activism, Becker and Wright, compared with controls. Yet people misconstrue BS as a pro-female ideology, resulting in a sneaky kind of prejudice that can be just as harmful to women as